persons. It has also been argued that professional athletes are discriminated against, in that the code does not allow for depreciation of their bodies. Organizations like the Authors League of America have contended further that the code is unfair to authors and other creative people whose income, because of the nature of their work and the economics of its marketing, is apt to fluctuate wildly from year to year, so that they are taxed exorbitantly in good years and are left with too little to tide them over bad years. A provision of the 1964 bill intended to take care of this situation provided creative artists, inventors, and other receivers of sudden large income with a 4-year averaging formula to ease the tax bite of a windfall year. But if the code is anti-intellectual, it is probably so only inadvertently, and is certainly so only inconsistently. By granting tax-exempt status to charitable foundations, it facilitates the award of millions of dollars a year, most of which would otherwise go into the government's coffers, to scholars for travel and living expenses while they carry out research projects of all kinds. And by making special provisions in respect to gifts of property that has appreciated in value, it has, whether advertently or inadvertently, tended not only to force up the prices that painters and sculptors receive for their work, but to channel thousands of works out of private collections and into public museums. The mechanics of this process are by now so well known that they need be merely outlined. A collector who donates a work of art to a museum may deduct on his income tax return the fair value of the work at the time of the donation and need pay no capital gains tax on any increase in its value since the time he bought it. If the increase in value has been great and the collector's tax bracket is very high, he may actually come out ahead on the deal. Besides burying some museums under such an avalanche of bounty that their staffs are kept busy digging themselves out, these provisions have tended to bring back into existence that lovable old figure from the pre-tax past, the rich dilettante. In recent years, some high-bracket people have fallen into the habit of making serial collections, post-impressionists for a few years, perhaps followed by Chinese jade, and then by modern American painting. At the end of each period, the collector gives away his entire collection, and when the taxes he would otherwise have paid are calculated, the adventure is found to have cost him practically nothing. The low cost of high-income people's charitable contributions, whether in the form of works of art or simply in the form of money and other property, is one of the oddest fruits of the code. Of approximately $5 billion claimed annually as deductible contributions on personal income tax returns, by far the greater part is in the form of assets of one sort or another that have appreciated in value and comes from persons with very high income. The reasons can be made clear by a simple example. A man with a top bracket of 20% who gives away $1,000 in cash incurs a net cost of $800. A man with a top bracket of 60% who gives away the same sum in cash incurs a net cost of $400. If instead, this same high bracket man gives $1,000 in the form of stock that he originally bought for $200, he incurs a net cost of only $200. It is the code's enthusiastic encouragement of large-scale charity that has led to most of the cases of million-dollar-a-year men who pay no tax at all. Under one of its most peculiar provisions, anyone whose income tax and contributions combined have amounted to 9/10 or more of his taxable income for 8 out of the 10 preceding years is entitled by way of reward to disregard in the current year the usual restrictions on the amount of deductible contributions and can escape the tax entirely. Thus, the code's provisions often enable mere fiscal manipulation to masquerade as charity, substantiating a frequent charge that the code is morally muddle-headed, or worse. The provisions also give rise to muddle-headedness in others. The appeal made by large fundraising drives in recent years, for example, has been uneasily divided between a call to good works and an explanation of the tax advantages to the donor. An instructive example is a commendably thorough booklet entitled Greater Tax Savings, a constructive approach, which was used by Princeton in a large capital funds drive. Similar, not to say nearly identical, booklets have been used by Harvard, Yale, and many other institutions. The responsibilities of leadership are great, particularly in an age when statesmen, scientists, and economists must make decisions which will almost certainly affect mankind for generations to come. The pamphlet's foreword starts out loftily and goes on to explain, the chief purpose of this booklet is to urge all prospective donors to give more serious thought to the manner in which they make their gifts. There are many different ways in which substantial gifts can be made at comparatively low cost to the donor. It is important that prospective donors acquaint themselves with these opportunities. The opportunities expounded in the subsequent pages include ways of saving on taxes through gifts of appreciated securities, industrial property, leases, royalties, jewelry, antiques, stock options, residences, life insurance, and inventory items, and through the use of trusts. The trust approach has great versatility. At one point, the suggestion is put forward that instead of actually giving anything away, the owner of appreciated securities may wish to sell them to Princeton for cash at the price he originally paid for them. This might appear to the simple-minded to be a commercial transaction, but the booklet points out accurately that in the eyes of the code, the difference between the security's current market value and the lower price at which they are sold to Princeton represents pure charity and is fully deductible as such. While we have laid heavy emphasis on the importance of careful tax planning, the final paragraph goes, "We hope no inference will be drawn that the thought and spirit of giving should in any way be subordinated to tax considerations. Indeed, it should not, nor need it be. With the heavy substance of giving so deftly minimized or actually removed, its spirit can surely fly unrestrained." One of the most marked traits of the code, to bring this ransacking of its character to a close, is its complexity, and this complexity is responsible for some of its most far-reaching social effects. It is a virtual necessity for many taxpayers to seek professional help if they want to minimize their taxes legally, and since first-rate advice is expensive and in short supply, the rich are thereby given still another advantage over the poor, and the code becomes more undemocratic in its action than it is in its provision. And the fact that fees for tax advice are themselves deductible means that tax advice is one more item on the long list of things that cost less and less to those who have more and more. All the free projects of taxpayer education and taxpayer assistance offered by the Internal Revenue Service, and they are extensive and well-meant, cannot begin to compete with the paid services of a good independent tax expert, if only because the IRS, whose first duty is to collect revenue, is involved in an obvious conflict of interest when it sets about explaining to people how to avoid taxes. The fact that about half of all the revenue derived from individual returns for 1960 came from adjusted gross incomes of $9,000 or less is not attributable entirely to provisions of the code. In part, it results from the fact that low-income taxpayers cannot afford to be shown how to pay less. The huge army of people who give tax advice, practitioners they're called in the trade, is a strange and disturbing side effect of the code's complexity. The exact size of this army is unknown, but there are a few guideposts. By a recent count, some 80,000 persons, most of them lawyers, accountants, and former IRS employees, held cards granted by the Treasury Department that officially entitle them to practice the trade of tax advisor and to appear as such before the IRs. In addition, there's an uncounted host of unlicensed and often unqualified persons who prepare tax returns for a fee, a service that anyone may legally perform. As for lawyers, the undisputed plutocrats, if not the undisputed aristocrats, of the tax advice industry, there is scarcely a lawyer in the country who is not concerned with taxes at one time or another during a year's practice. And every year there are more lawyers who are concerned with nothing else. The American Bar Association's taxation section, composed mostly of nothing but tax lawyers, has some 9,000 members. In the typical large New York law firm, 1 out of 5 lawyers devotes all of his time to tax matters. In the New York University Law School's tax department, an enormous brood hen for the hatching of tax lawyers is larger than the whole of an average law school. The brains that go into tax avoidance, which are generally recognized as including some of the best legal brains extant, constitute a wasted national resource. It is widely contended, and this contention is cheerfully upheld by some leading tax lawyers who seem only too glad to affirm, first, that their mental capacities are indeed exceptional, and second, that these capacities are indeed being squandered on trivia. The law has its cycles, one of them explained recently. In the United States, the big thing until about 1890 was property law. Then came a period when it was corporation law, and now its various specialties, of which the most important is taxes. I'm perfectly willing to admit that I'm engaged in work that has a limited social value. After all, what are we talking about when we talk about tax law? At best, only the question of what an individual or a corporation should fairly pay in support of the government. All right, why do I do tax work? In the first place, it's a fascinating intellectual game. Along with litigation, probably the most intellectually challenging branch of the law as it is now practiced. In the second place, although it's specialized in one sense, in another sense it isn't. It cuts through every field of law. One day you may be working with a Hollywood producer, the next day with a big real estate man, the next with a corporation executive. In the third place, it's a highly lucrative field. Hypocritically egalitarian on the surface and systematically oligarchic underneath, unconscionably complicated, whimsically discriminatory, specious in its reasoning, pettifogging in its language, demoralizing to charity, an enemy of discourse, a promoter of shop talk, a squanderer of talent, a rock of support to the property owner, but a weighty onus to the underpaid, an inconstant friend to the artist and scholar. If the national mirror image is all these things, it has its good points as well. Certainly no conceivable income. Tax law could please everybody, and probably no equitable one could entirely please anybody. Louis Eisenstein notes in his book, The Ideologies of Taxation, taxes are a changing product of the earnest effort to have others pay them. With the exception of its more flagrant special interest provisions, the code seems to be a sincerely written document, at worst misguided, that is aimed at collecting unprecedented amounts of money from an unprecedentedly complex society in the fairest possible way, at encouraging the national economy, and at promoting worthy undertakings. When it is intelligently and conscientiously administered, as it has been of late, our national income, tax law is quite possibly as equitable as any in the world. But to enact an unsatisfactory law and then try to compensate for its shortcomings by good administration is, clearly, an absurd procedure. One solution that is more logical, to abolish the income tax, is proposed chiefly by some members of the radical right who consider any income tax socialistic or communistic, and who would have the federal government simply stop spending money, though abolition is also advanced as a theoretical ideal rather than as a practical possibility by certain economists who are looking around for alternative ways of raising at least a significant fraction of the sums now produced by the income tax. One such alternative is a value-added tax, under which manufacturers, wholesalers, and retailers would be taxed on the difference between the value of the goods they bought and that of the goods they sold. Among the advantages claimed for it are that it would spread the tax burden more evenly through the productive process than a business income tax does, and that it would enable the government to get its money sooner. Several countries, including France and Germany, have value-added taxes, though as supplements rather than alternatives to income taxes. But no federal tax of the sort is more than remotely in prospect in this country. Other suggested means of lightening the burden of the income tax are to increase the number of items subject to excise taxes and apply a uniform rate to them, so as to create what would amount to a federal sales tax. To increase user taxes such as tolls on federally owned bridges and recreation facilities, and to enact a law permitting federal lotteries like the lotteries that were permitted from colonial times up to 1895, which helped finance such projects as the building of Harvard, the fighting of the Revolutionary War, and the building of many schools, bridges, canals, and roads. One obvious disadvantage of all these schemes is that they would collect revenue with relatively little regard to ability to pay. And for this reason or others, none of them stand a chance of being enacted in the foreseeable future. A special favorite of theoreticians, but of hardly anyone else, is something called the expenditure tax, the taxing of individuals on the basis of their total annual expenditures rather than on their income. The proponents of this tax, die-hard adherents of the economics of scarcity, argue that it would have the primary virtue of simplicity, that it would have the beneficial effect of encouraging savings, that it would be fairer than the income tax because it would tax what people took out of the economy rather than what they put into it, and that it would give the government a particularly handy control instrument with which to keep the national economy on an even keel. Its opponents contend that it wouldn't really be simple at all and would be ridiculously easy to evade, that it would cause the rich to become richer and doubtless stingier as well, and finally, that by putting a penalty on spending it would promote depression. In any event, both sides concede that its enactment in the United States is not now politically practicable, An expenditure tax was seriously proposed for the United States by Secretary of the Treasury Henry Morgenthau, Jr. in 1942, and for Britain by a Cambridge economist, later a special advisor to the National Treasury, named Nicholas Caldor in 1951, though neither proponent asked for a repeal of the income tax. Both proposals were all but unanimously hooted down. The expenditure tax is a beautiful thing to contemplate, one of its admirers said recently. It would avoid almost all the pitfalls of the income tax. But it's a dream, and so it is in the Western world. Such a tax has been put in effect only in Ceylon. With no feasible substitute in sight then, the income tax seems to be here to stay, and any hope for better taxation seems to lie in its reform. Since one of the code's chief flaws is its complexity, reform might well start with that. Efforts at simplification have been made with regularity since 1943, when Secretary Morgenthau set up a committee to study the subject. And there have been occasional small successes. Simplified instructions, for example, and a shortened form for taxpayers who wish to itemize deductions but whose affairs are relatively uncomplicated were both introduced during the Kennedy administration. Obviously, though, these were mere guerrilla, skirmish victories. One obstacle to any victory more sweeping is the fact that many of the code's complexities were introduced in no interest other than that of fairness to all, and apparently cannot be removed without sacrificing fairness. The evolution of the special family support provisions provides a striking example of how the quest for equity sometimes leads straight to complexity. Up to 1948, the fact that some states had and some didn't have community property laws resulted in an advantage to married couples in the community. Property states, those couples and those couples only, were allowed to be taxed as if their total income were divided equally between them, even though one spouse might actually have a high income and the other none at all. To correct this clear-cut inequity, the federal code was modified to extend the income, dividing privilege to all married persons, even apart from the resulting discrimination against single persons without dependents, which remains enshrined and unchallenged in the code today. This correction of one inequity led to the creation of another, the correction of which led to still another, before the Chinese box sequence was played. Out account had been taken of the legitimate special problems of persons who had family responsibilities, although they were not married, then of working wives with expenses for childcare during business hours, and then of widows and widowers. And each change made the code more complex. The loopholes are another matter. In their case, complexity serves not equity but its opposite, and their persistent survival constitutes a puzzling paradox. In a system under which the majority presumably makes the laws, tax provisions that blatantly favor tiny minorities over everybody else would seem to represent the civil rights principle run wild, a kind of anti-discrimination program for the protection of millionaires. The process by which new tax legislation comes into being, an original proposal from the Treasury Department or some other source, passage in turn by the House Ways and Means Committee, the whole House, the Senate Finance Committee, and the whole Senate, followed by the working out of a House, Senate compromise by a conference committee, followed by repassage by the House and the Senate, and, finally, followed by signing by the President, is indeed a torturous one, at any stage of which a bill may be killed or shelved. However, though the public has plenty of opportunity to protest special interest provisions, what public pressure there is apt to be greater in favor of them than against them. In the book on tax loopholes called The Great Treasury Raid, Philip M. Stern points out several forces that seem to him to work against the enactment of tax reform measures, among them the skill, power, and organization of the anti-reform lobbies, the diffuseness and political impotence of the pro-reform forces within the government, and the indifference of the general public, which expresses practically no enthusiasm for tax reform through letters to congressmen or by any other means, perhaps in large part because it is stunned into incomprehension and consequent silence by the mind-boggling technicality of the whole subject. In this sense, the code's complexity is its impenetrable elephant hide. Thus, the Treasury Department, which, as the agency charged with collecting federal revenues, has a natural interest in tax reform, is often left, along with a handful of reform-minded legislators like Senators Paul Haight, Douglas of Illinois, Albert Gore of Tennessee, and Eugene J. McCarthy of Minnesota, on a lonely and indefensible salient. Optimists believe that some point of crisis will eventually cause specially favored groups to look beyond their selfish interests and the rest of the country to overcome its passivity, to such an extent that the income tax will come to give back a more flattering picture of the country than it does now. When this will happen, if ever, they do not specify, but the general shape of the picture hoped for by some of those who care most about it is known. The ideal income tax envisioned for the far future by many reformers would be characterized by a short and simple code with comparatively low rates and with a minimum of exceptions to them. In its main structural features, this ideal tax would bear a marked resemblance to the 1913 income tax, the first ever to be put in effect in the United States in peacetime. So, if the unattainable visions of today should eventually materialize, the income tax would be just about back where it started. Chapter 4. A reasonable amount of time. Private information, whether of distant public events, impending business developments, or even the health of political figures, has always been a valuable commodity to traders in securities. So valuable that some commentators have suggested that stock exchanges are markets for such information just as much as for stocks. The money value that a market puts on information is often precisely measurable in terms of the change in stock prices that it brings about, and the information is almost as readily convertible into money as any other commodity. Indeed, to the extent that it is used for barter between traders, it is a kind of money. Moreover, until quite recently, the propriety of the use of inside dope for their own enrichment by those fortunate enough to possess it went largely unquestioned. Nathan Rothschild's judicious use of advance news of Wellington's victory at Waterloo was the chief basis of the Rothschild fortune in England, and no royal commission or enraged public rose to protest. Similarly, and almost simultaneously, on this side of the Atlantic, John J. Job Astor made an unchallenged bundle on advance news of the Ghent Treaty ending the War of 1812. In the post-Civil War era in the United States, the members of the investing public, such as it was, still docilely accepted the right of the insider to trade on his privileged knowledge, and were content to pick up any crumbs that he might drop along the way. Daniel Drew, a vintage insider, cruelly denied them even this consolation by dropping poisoned crumbs in the form of misleading memoranda as to his investment plans, which he would elaborately strew in public places. Most 19th century American fortunes were enlarged by, if they were not actually founded on, the practice of insider trading, and just how different our present social and economic order would be if such trading had been effectively forbidden in those days provides a subject for fascinating, if bootless, speculation. Not until 1910 did anyone publicly question the morality of corporate officers, directors, and employees trading in the shares of their own companies. Not until the 1920s did it come to be widely thought of as outrageous that such persons should be permitted to play the market game with what amounts to a stacked deck, and not until 1934 did Congress pass legislation intended to restore equity. The legislation, the Securities Exchange Act, requires corporate insiders to forfeit to their corporations any profits they may realize on short-term trades in their own firm's stock, and provides further in a section that was implemented in 1942 by a rule designated as 10.5, trader may use any scheme to defraud or make any untrue statement of a material fact, or omit to state a material fact. Since omitting to state material facts is the essence of using inside information, the law, while it does not forbid insiders to buy their own stock, nor to keep the profits provided they hold onto the stock more than 6 months, would seem to outlaw the stacked debt. In practice, though, until very recently, the 1942 rule was treated almost as if it didn't exist. It was invoked by the Securities and Exchange Commission, the federal enforcement body set up under the Securities Exchange Act, only rarely and in cases so flagrant as to be probably prosecutable even without it, under common law. And there were apparent reasons for this laxity. For one thing, it has been widely argued that the privilege of cashing in on their corporate secrets is a necessary incentive to business executives to goad them to their best efforts, and it is coolly contended by a few authorities that the uninhibited presence of insiders in the market, however offensive to the spirit of fair play, is essential to a smooth, orderly flow of trading. Moreover, it is contended that the majority of all stock traders, whether or not they are technically insiders, possess and conceal inside information of one sort or another, or at least hope and believe that they do, and that therefore an even-handed application of Rule 10.5 would result in even-handed application of Rule 10.5 would result in nothing less than chaos on Wall Street. So in letting the rule rest largely untroubled in the rulebook for 20 years, the SEC seemed to be consciously refraining from hitting Wall Street in one of its most vulnerable spots. But then, after a couple of preliminary jabs, it went for the spot with a vengeance. The lawsuit in which it did so was a civil complaint against the Texas Gulf Sulphur Company and 13 men who were directors or employees of that company. It was tried without a jury in the United States District Court in Foley Square on May 9th through June 21st, 1966, and as the presiding Judge Dudley J. Bonsall remarked mildly at one point during the trial, "I guess we all agree that we are plowing new ground here to some extent. Plowing and perhaps sowing too, Henry G. Mann, in a recent book entitled Insider Trading and the Stock Market, says that the case presents in almost classic terms the whole problem of insider trading and expresses the opinion that its resolution may determine the law in this field for many years to come." The events that led to the SEC action began in March 1959 when Texas Gulf, a New York City-based company that was the world's leading producer of sulfur, began conducting aerial geophysical surveys over the Canadian Shield, a vast, barren, forbidding area of eastern Canada that in the distant but not forgotten past had proved to be a fertile source of gold. What the Texas Gulf airmen were looking for was neither sulfur nor gold. Rather, it was sulfides, deposits of sulfur occurring in chemical combination with other useful minerals, such as zinc and copper. What they had in mind was discovering mineable veins of such minerals so that Texas Gulf could diversify its activities and be less dependent upon sulfur, the market price of which had been slipping. From time to time during the 2 years that the surveys went on intermittently, the geophysical instruments in the scanning planes would behave strangely, their needles jiggling in such a way as to indicate the presence of electrically conductive material in the earth. The areas where such things happened, called anomalies by geophysicists, were duly logged and mapped by the surveyors. All told, several thousand anomalies were found. It's a long way from an anomaly to a workable mine, as must be evident to anyone who knows that while most sulfides are electrically conductive, so are many other things, including graphite, the worthless pyrites called fool's gold, and even water. Nevertheless, several hundred of the anomalies that the Texas Gulfmen had found were considered to be worthy of ground investigation, and among the most promising-looking of all was one situated at a place designated on their maps as the Kidd 55 segment, 1 square mile of muskeg marsh, lightly wooded and almost devoid of outcropping rock. About 15 miles north of Timmins, Ontario, an old gold mining town that is itself some 350 miles northwest of Toronto. Since Kidd 55 was privately owned, the company's first problem was to get title to it, or to enough of it to make possible exploratory ground operations. For a large company to acquire land in an area where it is known to be engaged in mining exploration obviously involves delicacy in the extreme, and it was not until June 1963 the Texas Gulf was able to get an option permitting it to drill on the northeast quarter section of Kidd 55. On October 29th and 30th of that year, a Texas Gulf engineer, Richard A. Clayton, conducted a ground electromagnetic survey of the northeast quarter and was satisfied with what he found. A drill rig was moved to the site, and on November 8th, the first test drill hole was begun. There followed a thrilling, if uncomfortable, several days at Kidd 55. The man in charge of the drilling crew was a young Texas Gulf geologist named Kenneth Darkey, a cigar smoker with a rakish gleam in his eye, who looked a good deal more like the traditional notion of a mining prospector than that of the organization man he was. For 3 days the drilling went on, bringing out of the earth a cylindrical core of material 1.25 inches in diameter, which served as the first actual sample of what the rock under Kidd 55 contained. As the core came up, Dark studied it critically, inch by inch and foot by foot, using no instruments but only his eyes and his knowledge of what various mineral deposits look like in their natural state. On the evening of Sunday, November 10, by which time the drill was down 150 feet, Dark telephoned his immediate superior, Walter Hollick, Texas Gulf's chief geologist, at his home in Stamford, Connecticut, to report on his findings so far. He made the call from Timmins, since there was no telephone at the Kidd 55 drill site. Darkey, Hollick has since said, was excited, and so, apparently, was Holik after he had heard what Dark had to say, because he immediately set in motion quite a corporate flap for a Sunday night. That same evening, Holik called his superior, Richard D. Mollison, a Texas Gulf vice president who lived near Holik in Greenwich, and, still the same evening, Mollison called his boss, Charles F. Fogarty, executive vice president in the company's No. 2-man in nearby Rye, to pass Dark's report on up the line. Further reports were made the next day through the same labyrinth of command. Dark to Holik to Mollison to Fogarty. As a result of them, Holik, Mollison, and Fogarty all decided to go to Kidd 55 to see for themselves. Holik got there first. He arrived at Timmins on November 12th, checked in at the Bonaire Motel, and got out to Kidd 55 by Jeep and Muskeg tractor in time to see the completion of the drill hole and to help Dark visually estimate and log the core. By this time, the weather, which had hitherto been passable for Timmins in mid-November, had turned nasty. In fact, it was quite inclement. Holik, a Canadian in his 40s with a doctorate in geology from Massachusetts Institute of Technology, has since said it was cold, windy, threatening snow and rain, and we were much more concerned with personal comfort than we were with the details of the core hole. Ken Dark was writing, and I was looking at the core trying to make estimates of the mineral content. To add to the difficulty of working outdoors under such conditions, some of the core had come out of the ground covered with dirt and grease and had to be washed with gasoline before its contents could even be guessed at. Despite all difficulties, Holik succeeded in making an appraisal of the core that was, to say the least, startling. Over the 600 or so feet of its final length, he estimated there appeared to be an average copper content of 1.15s and an average zinc content of 8.64. A Canadian stockbroker with special knowledge of the mining industry was to say later that a drill core of such length and such mineral content is just beyond your wildest imagination. Texas Gulf didn't have a surefire mine yet. There was always the possibility that the mineral vein was a long, thin one, too limited to be commercially exploitable, and that by a fantastic chance the drill had happened to go down dip, that is, straight into the vein like a sword into a sheath. What was needed was a pattern of several drill holes, beginning at different spots on the surface and entering the earth at different angles, to establish the shape and limits of the deposit. And such a pattern could not be made until Texas Gulf had title to the other three-quarter segments of Kidd 55. Getting title would take time if it were possible at all, but meanwhile there were several steps that the company could and did take. The drill rig was moved away from the side of the test hole. Cut saplings were stuck in the ground around the hole to restore the appearance of the place to a semblance of its natural state. A second test hole was drilled, as ostentatiously as possible, some distance away, at a place where a barren core was expected, and found. All of these camouflage measures, which were in conformity with long-established practice among miners who suspect that they have made a strike, were supplemented by an order from Texas Gulf's president, Claude O. Stevens, that no one outside the actual exploration group, even within the company, should be told what had been found. Late in November, the core was shipped off in sections to the Union Assay Office in Salt Lake City for scientific analysis of its contents. And meanwhile, of course, Texas Gulf began discreetly putting out feelers for the purchase of the rest of Kidd 55. And meanwhile, other measures which may or may not have been related to the events north of Timmins were being taken. On November 12, Fogarty bought 300 shares of Texas Gulf stock. On the 15th, he added 700 more shares. On November 19th, 500 more, and on November 26th, 200 more. And on November 26th, Clayton bought 200 on the 15th, Mollison 100 on the same day, and Mrs. Holik bought 50 on the 29th and 100 more on December 10th. But these purchases, as things turned out, were only the harbingers of a period of apparently intense affection for Texas Gulf stock among certain of its officers and employees, and even some of their friends. In mid-December, the report on the core came back from Salt Lake City, and it showed that Holik's rough and ready estimate had been amazingly accurate. The copper and zinc contents were found to be almost exactly what he had said, and there were 3.94 ounces of silver per ton thrown in as a sort of bonus. Latte in December, Dark made a trip to Washington, D.C. and vicinity, where he recommended Texas Gulf stock to a girl he knew there and her mother. These two, who came to be designated in the trial as the Tippies, subsequently passed along the recommendation to two other persons, who logically enough thereby became the sub-tip. Between December 30th and the following February 17, Dark's tippies and sub-tippies purchased all told 2,100 shares of Texas Gulf stock, and in addition, they purchased what are known in the brokerage trade as calls on 1,500 additional shares. A call is an option to buy a stated amount of a certain stock at a fixed price, generally near the current market price, at any time during a stated period. Calls on most listed stocks are always on sale by dealers who specialize in them. The purchaser pays a generally rather moderate sum for his option. If the stock then goes up during the stated period, the rise can easily be converted into almost pure profit for him, while if the stock stays put or goes down, he simply tears up his call the way a horse player tears up a losing ticket and loses nothing but the cost of the call. Therefore, calls provide the cheapest possible way of gambling on the stock market and the most convenient way of converting inside information into cash. Back in Timmins, Dark put temporarily out of business as a geologist by the winter freeze and a land ownership problem at Kidd. 55 seems to have managed to keep time from hanging heavy on his hands. In January, he entered into a private partnership with another Timmins man who wasn't a Texas Gulf employee to stake and claim crown lands around Timmins for their own benefit. In February, he told Holick of a barroom conversation that had occurred in Timmins one gelid winter evening, in which an acquaintance of his had let fall that he'd heard rumors of a Texas Gulf strike nearby, and was therefore going to stake a few claims of his own. Horrified, Holick, as he recalled later, told Dark to reverse the previous policy of avoiding Kidd. 55 like the plague, and to go right into the EI. A-Ranch take all the claims we need. Also to steer away this acquaintance, give him a helicopter ride or anything, just get him out of the way. Dark presumably complied with this order. Moreover, during the first 3 months of 1964, he bought 300 shares of Texas Gulf outright, bought calls on 3,000 more shares, and added several more persons, one of them his brother, to his growing list of tippies. Holick and Clayton were somewhat less financially active during the same period, but they did add substantially to their Texas Gulf holdings. In the case of Holick and his wife, particularly through the use of calls, which they'd scarcely even heard of before, but which were getting to be quite dead. Rage in Texas Gulf circles. Signs of spring began to come at last, and with them came a triumphant conclusion to the company's land acquisition program. By March 27, Texas Gulf had pretty much what it needed. That is, it had either clear title or mineral rights to the 3 remaining segments of Kidd, 55, except for 10% profit concessions on 2 of the segments, the stubborn owner of the concession in one case being the Curtis Publishing Company. After a final burst of purchases by Dark, his tippies, and his sub-tippies on March 30th and 31st, among them all, 600 shares and calls on 5,100 more shares for the 2 days. Drilling was resumed in the still frozen muskeg at Kidd 55, with Holick and Dark both on the site this time. The new hole, the third in all, but only the second operational one, since one of the 2 drilled in November had been the dummy intended to create a diversion, was begun at a point some distance from the first and at an oblique angle to it to advance the bracketing process. Observing and logging the core as it came out of the ground, Holick found that he could scarcely hold a pencil because of the cold. But he must have been warmed inwardly by the fact that promising mineralization began to appear after the first 100 feet. He made his first progress report to Fogarty by telephone on April 1st. Now, a grueling daily routine was adopted at Timmins and Kidd. 55. The actual drilling crew stayed at the site continuously, while the geologists, in order to keep their superiors in New York posted, had to make frequent trips to telephones in Timmins. And what with the 7-foot snowdrifts along the way, the 15-mile trek between the town and the drilling. Camp customarily took 3.5 to 4 hours. One after another, new drill holes begun at different places around the anomaly and pitched at different angles to it were plunged into the earth. At first, only one drill rig could be used at a time because of a shortage of water, which was necessary to the operation. The ground was frozen solid and covered by deep snow, and water had to be laboriously pumped from under the ice on a pond about a half-mile from Kidd 55. The third hole was finished on April 7th, and a fourth immediately begun with the same rig. The following day, the water shortage having eased somewhat, a fifth hole was inaugurated with a second drill rig, and 2 days after that, on the 10th, a third rig was pressed into service to drill still another hole. All in all, during the first days of April, the principals in the affair were kept busy. In fact, during that period, their buying of calls on Texas Gulf seems to have come to a standstill. Bit by bit, the drilling revealed the lineaments of a huge ore deposit. The third hole established that the original one had not gone down dip as had been feared. The fourth established that the mineral vein was a satisfactorily deep one, and so on. At some point, the exact point was to become a matter of dispute. Texas Gulf came to know that it had a workable mine of considerable proportions, and as this point approached, the focus of attention shifted from drillers and geologists to staff men and financiers who were to be the principal object of the SEC's disapproval later on. At Timmins, snow fell so heavily on April 8th and most of the 9th that not even the geologists could get from the town to Kidded, 55. But toward evening on the 9th, when they finally made it after a hair-raising journey of 7.5 hours, with them was no lesser light than Vice President Mollison, who had turned up in Timmins the previous day. Mollison spent the night at the drill site and left at about noon the next day. In order, he explained later, to avoid the outdoorsman's lunch they served at Kid 55, which was too hearty for a desk-bound man like him. But before going, he issued instructions for the drilling of a mill test hole, which would produce a relatively large core that could be used to determine the amenability of the mineral material to routine mill processing. Normally, a mill test hole is not drilled until a workable mine is believed to exist. And so it may have been in this case, 2 SEC. Mining experts were to insist later, against contrary opinions of experts for the defense, that by the time Mollison gave his order, Texas Gulf had information on the basis of which it could have calculated that the ore reserves at Kidd 5 had a gross assay value of at least $200 million. The famous Canadian mining grapevine was humming by now, and in retrospect, the wonder is that it had been relatively quiet for so long. A Toronto broker was to remark during the trial, "I've seen drillers drop the goddamn drill and beat it for a brokerage office as fast as they can. Where else is they pick up the telephone and call Toronto?" After such a call, the broker went on, the status of every Bay Street penny. Stocked out depends, for a time, on how close a personal acquaintance he can claim with the driller who made the strike, just as a racetracked out status depends sometimes on the degree of intimacy he can claim with a jockey or a horse. The Moccasin Telegraph has Texas Gulf's activity centered in Kidd Township. "A battery of drills are reported to be at work," said the Northern Miner, a Toronto weekly of immense influence in the mining stock set. On the 9th, and the same day, the Toronto Daily Star declared that Timmins was bug-eyed with excitement and that the magic word on every street corner and in every street corner and in every street corner and in every barber shop is Texas Gulf. The phones in Texas Gulf's New York headquarters were buzzing with frenzied queries, which the officers coldly turned aside. On the 10th, President Stevens was concerned enough about the rumors to seek counsel from one of his most trusted associates, Thomas S. Lamont, senior member of the Texas Gulf Board of Directors, former second-generation Morgan partner, holder of various lofty offices past and present in the Morgan Guaranty Trust Company, and bearer of a name that had long been one to conjure with in Wall Street. Stevens told Lamont what had been going on north of Timmins. It was the first Lamont had heard of it, made it clear that he himself did not yet feel that the evidence justified bug eyes, and asked what Lamont thought ought to be done about the exaggerated report. "As long as they stayed in the Canadian press," Lamont replied, "I think you might be able to live with them. However," he added, "if they should get into the papers in the United States, it might be well to give the press an announcement that would set the record straight and avoid undue gyrations in the stock market." The following day, Saturday the 11th, the reports reached the United States papers with a bang. The Times and Herald Tribune both ran accounts on the Texas Gulf discovery, and the latter, putting its story on the front page, spoke of the biggest ore strike since gold was discovered more than 60 years ago in Canada. After reading these stories, perhaps with eyes bugging slightly, Stevens notified Fogarty that a press release should be issued in time for Monday's papers, and over the weekend Fogarty, with the help of several other company officials, worked one up. Meanwhile, things were not standing still at Kidd 55. On the contrary, later testimony held that on Saturday and Sunday, as more and more core came up from the drill holes full of copper and zinc ore, the calculable value of the mine was increasing almost hour by hour. However, Fogarty did not communicate with Timmins after Friday night, so the statement that he and his colleagues issued to the press on Sunday afternoon was not based on the most minute information. Whether because of that or for some other reason, the statement did not convey the idea that Texas Gulf thought it had a new Comstock lot. Characterizing the published reports as exaggerated and unreliable, it admitted only that recent drilling on one property near Timmins had led to preliminary indications that more drilling would be required for proper evaluation of the prospect. Went on to say that the drilling done to date has not been conclusive, and then, putting the same thought in what can hardly be called another way, added that the work done to date has not been sufficient to reach definite conclusion. The idea thus couched, or perhaps one should say bedded down, evidently came across to the public when it appeared in Monday morning's newspapers, because Texas Gulf stock was not nearly so buoyant early that week as it might have been expected to be if the enthusiastic Times and Herald Tribune stories had gone unchallenged. The stock, which had been selling at around 17 or 18 the previous November, and had crept up over the intervening months to around 30, opened Monday on the New York Stock Exchange at 32, a rise of nearly 2 points over Friday's closing, a lie to reverse direction and sink to 37 right before the day's trading was over, and to slip off still further on the following 2 days and at one point on Wednesday touch a low of 28.78. Evidently, investors and traders had been considerably impressed by Texas Gulf's Sunday mood of deprecation. But on those same 3 days, Texas Gulf people in both Canada and New York seemed to have been in quite another mood. At Kidd, 55 on Monday the 13th, the day the low-keyed press release was reported in newspapers, the mill test hole was completed. Drills continued to grind away on 3 regular test holes, and a reporter for the Northern Miner was shown around and briefed on the findings by Mollison, Howick, and Belallison Howick. Darky, the things they told the reporter make it clear in retrospect that whatever the drafters of the release may have believed on Sunday, the men at Kidd 55 knew on Monday that they had a mine and a big one. However, the world was not to know it, or at least not from that source, until Thursday morning, when the next issue of the Miner would appear in subscribers' mail and on newsstands. Tuesday evening, Mollison and Hollake flew to Montreal, where they were planning to attend the annual convention of the Canadian Institute of Mining and Metallurgy, a gathering of several hundred leading mining and investment people. Upon arriving at the Queen Elizabeth Hotel, where the convention was in progress, Mollison and Hollake were startled to find themselves greeted like film stars. The place had evidently been humming all day with rumors of a Texas Gulf discovery, and everyone wanted to be the first to get the first-hand lowdown on it. In fact, a battery of television cameras had been set up for the express purpose of covering such remarks as the emissaries from Timmins might want to make. Not being authorized to make any remarks, Mollison and Hollake turned abruptly on their heels and fled the Queen Elizabeth, holing up for the night in a Montreal airport motel. The following day, Wednesday the 15th, they flew from Montreal to Toronto in the company, by pre-arrangement of the Minister of Mines of the province of Ontario and his deputy. En route, they briefed the minister on the Kidd 55 situation, whereupon the minister declared that he wanted to clear the air by making a public announcement on the matter as soon as possible, and then, with Mollison's help, he drafted such an announcement. According to a copy that Mollison made and kept, the announcement stated in part that the information now in hand gives the company confidence to allow me to announce that Texas Gulf Sulfur has a mineable body of zinc, copper, and silver ore of substantial dimensions that will be developed and brought to production as soon as possible. Mollison and Hollake were given to believe that the minister would make his statement in Toronto at 11 o'clock that evening, over radio and television, and that thus Texas Gulf's good news would become public property a few hours before the Northern Miner appeared early the next day. But for reasons that have never been given, the minister didn't make the announcement that evening. At Texas Gulf headquarters at 200 Park Avenue, there was a similar air of mounting crisis. The company happened to have a regular monthly board of directors meeting scheduled for Thursday morning, and on Monday, Francis Coates, a director who lived in Houston, Texas, and who hadn't heard of the Kidd 55 strike, telephoned Stevens to inquire whether he ought to bother to come. Stevens said he ought, but didn't explain why. Better and better news kept filtering in from the drill site, and sometime on Wednesday, the Texas Gulf officers decided that it was time to write a new press release, to be issued at a press conference that would follow the Thursday morning directors' meeting. Stevens, Fogarty, and David M. Crawford, the company's secretary, composed the release that afternoon. This time around, the release was based on the very latest information, and moreover, its language was happily devoid of both repetition and equivocation. It read, in part, Texas Gulf Sulphur Company has made a major strike of zinc, copper, and silver in the Timmins area. 7 drill holes are now essentially complete and indicate an ore body of at least 800 feet in length and having a vertical depth of more than 800 feet in width is a major discovery. The preliminary data indicate a reserve of more than 25 million tons of ore. As to the striking difference between this release and the one of 3 days earlier, the new one stated that considerably more data has been accumulated in the interim. And no one could deny this. A reserve of more than 25 million tons of ore meant that the value of the ore was not the $200 million that was alleged to have been calculable a week earlier, but many times that much. In the course of the same hectic day in New York, the engineer Clayton and the company secretary Crawford found time to call their brokers and order themselves some Texas Gulf stock. 200 shares in Clayton's case, 300 in Crawford. And Crawford soon decided that he hadn't plunged deeply enough. Shortly after 8 o'clock the next morning, after an apparently preoccupied night at the Park Lane Hotel, he awakened his broker with a second call and doubled his order. On Thursday morning, the first hard news of the Timmins strike spread through the North American investment world, rapidly but erratically. Between 7 and 8 o'clock, mailmen and newsstands in Toronto began distributing copies of the Northern Miner containing the piece by the reporter who had visited Kid 55, in which he described the strike with a good deal of mining jargon but did not omit to call it, in language comprehensible, enough for anyone, a brilliant exploration success and a major new zinc copper, silver mine. At about the same time, the Miner was on its way out to subscribers south of the border in Detroit and Buffalo, and a few hundred newsstand copies appear to have arrived in New York between 9 and 10 o'clock. The paper's physical appearance here, however, was preceded by telephone reports on its contents from Toronto, and by about 9:15 the news that Texas Gulf had hit it big for sure was the talk of New York brokerage offices. A customer's man in the 60th Street office of E.F. Hutton E. Company complained later that his broker cronies had been so eager to natter on the telephone about Texas Gulf early that morning as to substantially prevent him from communicating with his customers. However, he did manage to squeeze in a call to 2 of them, a husband and wife for whom he was able to turn a rather quick profit in Texas Gulf. To be exact, a profit of $10,500 in less than an hour. It is clear that we are all in the wrong business, Judge Bonsall was to comment when he heard this. Or, as the late Weiland Wagner once remarked in another context, I shall be quite explicit. Valhalla is Wall Street. At the stock exchange itself early that day, the traders in the luncheon club, which before the 10 o'clock opening serves as a breakfast club, were all munching on the Texas Gulf situation along with their toast and eggs at the directors' meeting at 200 Park, which began promptly at 9. The directors were shown the news statement that was shortly to be released to the press, and Stevens, Fogarty, Holick, and Mollison, as representatives of the exploration group, commented in turn on the Timmins discovery. Stevens also stated that the Ontario Minister of Mines had announced it publicly in Toronto the previous evening. A misstatement, of course, although an unintentional one. Actually, the minister was making his announcement to the Ontario Parliament Press Gallery in Toronto at almost the same moment Stevens was speaking. The directors' meeting ended at about 10 o'clock. Whereupon a clutch of reporters, 22 of them representing many of the major United States newspapers and magazines, general and financial, rooped into the boardroom for the press conference. The Texas Gulf directors all remaining in their places. Stevens distributed copies of the press release to the reporters, and then, in fulfillment of a curious ritual that governed such affairs, read it aloud. While he was engaged in this redundant recital, various reporters began to drift away. They began sort of leaking out of the room, was the way Lamont put it later, to telephone the sensational news to their publications. Still more of them slipped away during the events that subsequently rounded out the press conference. The showing of some innocuous colored slides of the countryside around Timmins and an explanation by Holick of some drill course. And by the time it ended, at around 10:15, only a handful of reporters were left. This certainly didn't mean that the affair had been a flop. On the contrary, a press conference is perhaps the only kind of show whose success is in direct proportion to the number of people who leave before it is over. The actions of 2 of the Texas Gulf directors, Coates and Lamont, during the next half hour or so, or to give rise to the most controversial part of the SEAES complaint. And since the controversy has now been inscribed in the law, those actions are likely to be studied for at least a generation by inside stock traders seeking guidance as to what they must do to be saved, or at least to avoid being damned. The essence of the controversy was timing, and in particular, the timing of Coates's and Lamont's maneuvers in relation to that of the dissemination of the Texas Gulf News by the Dow Jones News Service, the familiar spot news facility for investors. Few investment offices in the United States are without the service, and its prestige is such that in some investment circles, the moment a piece of news becomes public is considered to be determined by the moment it crosses the broad tape. As to the morning of April 16, 1964, a Dow Jones reporter was not only among those at the Texas Gulf press conference, but was among those who left early to telephone the news to his office. According to his recollection, the reporter made his call between 10:10 and 10:15, and normally an item of such importance as the one he sent would begin to be printed out by Dow Jones machines in offices from coast to coast within 2 or 3 minutes after being telephoned in. In fact, though, the Texas Gulf story did not begin to appear until 10:54, an entirely inexplicable 40-odd minutes later. The mystery of the broad tape message, like the mystery of the Minister of Mines' announcement, was left unraveled in the trial on grounds of irrelevance. An engaging aspect of the rules of evidence is their tendency to leave a few things to the imagination. Coates, the Texan, was the first director to embark upon what he can hardly have thought of at the time as a historically significant course. Either before or immediately after the end of the press conference, he went into an office adjoining the boardroom, where he borrowed a telephone and called his son-in-law, H. Fred Haymeskeger, who is a stockbroker in Houston. Coates, as he related later, told Haymeskeger of the Texas Gulf discovery and added that he had waited to call until after the public announcement because he was too old to get into trouble with the SO. He then placed an order for 2,000 shares of Texas Gulf stock for 4 family trusts of which he was a trustee, though not personally a beneficiary. The stock, which had opened on the stock exchange some 20 minutes earlier at a fraction above 30 in very active but by no means decisively bullish trading, was now rapidly on its way up. But by acting quickly, Haymeskeger managed to buy the block for Coates at between 31 and 31.58, getting his orders into his firm's floor broker well before the unaccountably delayed news began to come out on the broad tape. Lamont, in the Wall Street tradition of plungers rather than the Texas one, made his move with decision, but with an elegant, almost languorous lack of hurry. Instead of leaving the boardroom at the conclusion of the press conference, he stayed there for some 20 minutes, not doing much of anything. I milled around and listened to some of them chatter and talk with each other and slapped people on the back, he recounted later. Then at 10:39 or 10:40, he went to a nearby office and telephoned a colleague and friend of his at the Morgan Guaranty Trust Company, Longstreet Hinton, the bank's executive vice president and the head of its trust department. Earlier in the week, Hinton had asked Lamont if he, as a Texas Gulf director, could shed any light on the rumors of an ore discovery that were appearing in the press, and Lamont had replied that he couldn't. Now Lamont, as he recalled later, told Hinton that there was news which had come out, or was shortly coming out, on the ticker, which would be of interest to him, regarding Texas Gulf sulfur. "Is it good?" Hinton asked, and Lamont replied that it was pretty good or very good. Neither man is sure which he said, but it doesn't matter, since in New York bankeries pretty good means very good. In any case, Hinton did not follow the advice to look at the Dow Jones ticker, even though a machine was ticking 20 feet from his office. Instead, he immediately called the bank's trading department and asked for a market quotation on Texas Gulf. After getting it, he placed an order to buy 3,000 shares for the account of the Nassau Hospital, of which he was treasurer. All this occupied no more than 2 minutes from the time Lamont had left the press conference. The order had been transmitted from the bank to the stock exchange and executed, and Nassau Hospital had its stock before Hinton would have seen anything about Texas Gulf on the broad tape if he had been looking at it. But he was not looking at it. He was otherwise occupied. After placing the Nassau Hospital order, he went to the office of the Morgan Guaranty officer in charge of pension trusts and suggested that he buy some Texas Gulf for the trusts. In a matter of less than a half an hour, the bank had ordered 7,000 shares for its pension fund and profit sharing account. 2,000 of them before the announcement had begun to appear on the broad tape, and the rest either while it was appearing or within a few minutes afterward. A bit more than an hour after that, at 12:33 p.m., Lamont bought 3,000 shares for himself and members of his family, this time having to pay $34.5 for them since Texas Gulf by that time was on its way up for fair, as it was to continue to be for days, months, and years. It closed that afternoon at 36.38. It reached a high of 58.38 later that month. And by the end of 1966, when commercial production of ore was at last underway at Kidd 55 and the enormous new mine was expected to account for 1/10 of Canada's total annual production of copper and 1/4 of its total annual production of zinc, the stock was selling at over 100. Anyone who had bought Texas Gulf between November 12, 1963 in the morning, or even the lunch hour of April 16, 1964, had therefore at least tripled his money. Perhaps the most arresting aspect of the Texas Gulf trial, apart from the fact that a trial was taking place at all, was the vividness and variety of the defendants who came before Judge Bonsall, ranging as they did from a hot-eyed mining prospector like Clayton, a genuine Welshman with a degree mining from the University of Cardiff, through vigorous and harried corporate nabobs like Fogarty and Stevens to a Texas wheeler, dealer like Coates and a polished Brahmin of finance like Lamont. Darkey, who had left Texas Gulf's employ soon after April 1964 to become a private investor, which may or may not indicate that he had become a man of independent means, declined to appear at the trial on the ground that his Canadian nationality put him beyond the reach of subpoena by a United States court, and the SEC grieved loudly over this refusal. Defense counsel, however, scornfully insisted that the SEC was really delighted to have Dark absent, thus allowing plaintiff to paint him as Mephistopheles hiding in the wings. The SEC, after its counsel, Frank E. Kennemer Jr., had announced his intention to drag to light and pillory the misconduct of these defendants, asked the court to issue a permanent injunction forbidding Fogarty, Mollison, Clayton, Holick, Darkey, Crawford, and several other corporate insiders who had bought stock or calls between November 8, 1963 and April 15, 1964, from ever again engaging in any act as a fraud or deceit upon any person in connection with purchase or sale of securities. Further, and here it was breaking entirely new ground, it prayed that the court order the defendants to make restitution to the persons they had allegedly defrauded by buying stock or calls from them on the basis of inside information. The SEC also charged that the pessimistic April 12th press release was deliberately deceptive, and asked that because of it, Texas Gulf be enjoined from making any untrue statement of material fact or omitting to state a material fact. Apart from any question of loss of corporate face, the nub of the matter here lay in the fact that such a judgment, if granted, might well open the way for legal action against the company by any stockholder who had sold his Texas Gulf stock to anybody in the interim between the first press release and the second one, and since the shares that had changed hands during that period had run into the millions, it was a nub indeed. Apart from legal technicalities, counsel based its defense of the early insider stock purchases chiefly on the argument that the information yielded by the first drill hole in November had made the prospect of a workable mine not a sure thing but only a sporting proposition, and to buttress this argument, it paraded before the judge a platoon of mining experts who testified as to the notorious fickleness of first drill holes. Some of the witnesses going so far as to say that the hole might very well have turned out to be not an asset, but a liability to Texas Gulf. The people who had bought stock or calls during the winter insisted that the drill hole had had little or nothing to do with their decision. They had been motivated simply by the feeling that Texas Gulf was a good investment at that juncture on general principles, and Clayton attributed his abrupt appearance as a substantial investor to the fact that he had just married a well-to-do wife. The SEC countered with its own parade of experts, maintaining that the nature of the first core had been such as to make the existence of a rich mine an overwhelming probability, and that therefore those privy to the facts about it had possessed a material fact. As the SEC put it saltily in a post-trial brief, the argument that the defendants were free to purchase the stock until the existence of a mine had been established beyond doubt is equivalent to saying that there is no unfairness in betting on a horse entered in a race, knowing that the animal has received an illegal stimulant because in the home stretch the horse might drop dead. Defense counsel declined to be drawn into argument on the equine analogy. As to the pessimistic April 12th release, the SEC made much of the fact that Fogarty, its chief drafter, had based it on information that was almost 48 hours old when it was issued, despite the fact that communications between Kidd, Five, Timmins, and New York were relatively good at the time, and expressed the view that the most indulgent explanation for his strange conduct is that Dr. Fogarty simply did not care whether he gave the shareholders of Texas Gulf and the public a discouraging statement based on stale information. Brushing aside the question of staleness, the defense asserted that the release accurately stated the status of the drilling in the opinion of Stevens, Fogarty, Mollison, Holake, and Clayton, that the problem presented was obviously one of judgment, and that the company had been in a particularly difficult and sensitive position, and that if it had, instead, issued an overly optimistic report that had later proved to have been based on false hopes, it could just as well have then been accused of fraud for that. Weighing the crucial question of whether the information obtained from the first drill hole had been material, Judge Bonsall concluded that the definition of materiality in such instances must be a conservative one. There was, he pointed out, a question of public policy involved. It is important under our free enterprise system that insiders, including directors, officers, and employees, be encouraged to own securities of their company. The incentive that comes with stock ownership benefits both the company and the stockholders. Keeping his definition conservative, he decided that up until the evening of April 9th, when 3 converging drill holes positively established the three-dimensionality of the ore deposit, material information had not been in hand, and the decisions of the insiders to buy Texas Gulf stock before that date, even if based on the drilling results, were no more than perfectly sporting and legal, educated guesses. A newspaper columnist who disagreed with the judge's finding was to remark that the guesses had been so educated as to qualify for summa cum laude. In the case of Darkey, the judge found that the spate of stock purchases by his types and subtips on the last days of March seemed highly likely to have been instigated by word from Dark that drilling at Kidd 55 was about to be resumed. But even here, according to Judge Bonsall's logic, material information did not yet exist and therefore could neither be acted upon nor passed along to others. Case was therefore dismissed against all educated guessers who had bought stock or calls or made recommendations to tippies before the evening of April 9th, with Clayton and Crawford, who had been so injudicious